In the story that Linda read, and this was in Mark chapter, any children who'd like to go downstairs to Children's Church, you are dismissed to go with Tanya. Don't mess with Tanya. She's in charge. And she probably has a few enforcers nearby. But anyway, if you are 4 years old and up, you are welcome to go with him to Children's Church. In the story that Linda read in Mark chapter 9, which we're going to look at in a moment, there's a phrase, I have it there in your bulletin. She read it in a different translation, where Jesus is kind of surprised by the attitude that people would bring to him when they say, well, if you could do anything, Lord, if there's something you could do about this. And Jesus said, what do you mean, if? Can you believe? Have a little faith, because if you can believe, anything can happen. That's what he said. And a song I've had in my heart this morning, and you've heard this song before, but I'm going to sing part of it because it contains this phrase in the first verse. This is a hymn from our hymn book written by Jack Hayford out in California. And it says, speak now this name believing, nothing beyond conceiving lies beyond his power. And that's what Jesus was saying. Anything. There is nothing that is impossible or impossible. Speak now this name believing, no other thing, nothing beyond conceiving lies beyond his power. It's a song about healing. And this miracle, this story that she read is about a healing. In this case, the kid was afflicted by a demon, not simply a physiological disease, but actually a spiritual oppression of a demonic spirit. Cole, should I switch to this microphone? Would that be the best? Go for it. Okay. I guess I should turn that off. We'll see if you can hear this. Hear now the name I'm singing. Here is the name revealing all God's love and healing comes to this house. Open your hearts receiving. Speak now this name believing. Jesus said, Jesus, the name above all names. Jesus, the Lord, King of kings. His name is life. His name is health. Oh, body, mind, and soul. Jesus, the name we sing. In Jesus' name we're bringing all God's love and healing here to you. This verse talks about the flesh of Jesus, the humanity of Jesus, and how it is that even the prophets said that our griefs are borne by him. So this little boy whose life is torn by a demon, or some of us whose body is afflicted, our bodies are afflicted by different sicknesses, or people who are just dealing with grief or loss from a divorce, or all sorts of these human miseries that, in a sense, he already has carried the weight of it so that we can give it to him. Pain and affliction bear it. Pain and affliction bear it. Where is this flesh we're wearing? Mankind is weak, this weakness sharing, crying to be whole. But Christ bore the stripes in sorrow, paid all that we might would like to look at this story, this incident in Mark chapter 9, to make some comments about this issue of faith, what I'm calling here the cry of faith, when this father with his son found himself needing faith as he brought this child to the Lord. The story starts in Mark 9, verse 14, and starts with a familiar disappointment to many of us. We go away on vacation. We have some amazing respite. We go on a trip. We get away. And then we got to come home. And we say, oh, man, really? And in the case of the disciples, Peter, James, and John, who were with Jesus at this particular instance, the escape, the mountaintop, the vacation, had literally been on a mountaintop. It's the story of when Jesus, it says, took his disciples, these three men, way up on a mountain and blew their minds. Because it says, there appeared Moses and Elijah and talked with him. And then it says his whole being turned dazzling white. He was transformed in front of them. And then, if that wasn't enough, they heard a voice out of the clouds that they knew whose voice it was. And it said, this is my son, better listen to him. I mean, when you have a vacation like that, you really don't want to come back home. When you have had an experience like that, it's beyond staying in a great hotel or skiing or swimming or whatever it was that you might have done to get away. This was literally a mountaintop experience for them. And then it says in Mark chapter 9 that they came down the mountain. Every time I read that, I kind of smile to myself and say, welcome home, boys. Isn't that wonderful to come back to the real world where suddenly, work calls, phone waits, people are clamoring, and people are arguing, and people are, doing the normal things that people do. In fact, in the beginning of this story, in verse 14, it says that when they got back, the first thing they encountered when they came down from the mountaintop was this group of people. And a big argument was going on. That's what it says. And I just say, when I read that, I just smile and I say, how typical. I get a couple days away, I have some time off, and I'm just stoked. I'm so happy, and I come home and already somebody's mad at somebody, somebody's hurting, somebody's arguing. It's the real world. That's why I say we have briars and we have battles. From the beginning we had briars in the garden. The Lord said, this is going to be a rough ride for you. Thorns and thistles are going to crown your life, are going to plague your life. But more than that, you're going to have people problems. You're not just going to have briars, but you're also going to have battles that you're going to face. And people are going to be in arguments around you, and you've got to take sides. Sometimes the arguments involve yourself. And that's what it says that they encountered in verse 14 of Mark chapter 9. The teachers of the law and the disciples were arguing. Now, why were these teachers of the law, these Pharisees, these people who committed themselves to obeying the law of Moses, why were they arguing with the other 9 or the rest of the group of disciples of Jesus, so that Peter, James, and John and Jesus came upon this? What were they arguing about? I don't know for sure, but I can only presume that they were arguing over this very issue that became prominent and evident very quickly with this father and his son who was possessed by a demon. Because the father came and said, in a moment, he came to Jesus. In fact, he came running to Jesus when he saw him, and he said, Jesus, so glad you're here. I was trying to have your disciples heal my son. I brought my son, and I asked them, since you weren't around, if they would heal him. And they tried, and they couldn't do it. And I'm so glad you're here. Now, I don't know, but I'm guessing that these Pharisees and disciples were probably arguing over why this thing wouldn't work. Probably the Pharisees were trying to embarrass his disciples. You see, there's no power in Christ, in the name of Christ. It didn't work, did it? I suppose that's probably what they were arguing about. I don't know for sure, but they were bickering. It was the real world. And so this disappointing reality of leaving the top of the mountain with the beautiful views and the fresh air and the wonderful relaxation, and then having to come back to the job or the family or, all the demands and so forth. And yet that's what Jesus encountered, and that's what we encountered. It's always going to happen that way. And my point, just to start, just as a thought, sort of a sidelight, is we cannot live up there. We can't stay up there. These mountaintop experiences that the Lord gives us, whether it's a physical vacation or whether it's more of a spiritual getaway or something, it's not given to us for an escape. It's given to us, God gives us these times as encouragement, to build us up, to give us strength, to go back down and face the bickering crowd and the fussing people and life in the family on planet Earth. That's why God allows us to have. In other words, Peter, this is the very thing Peter was trying to avoid. When Peter was up there on the mountain, he said, Lord, I'd like to build a house right here. In fact, I'll just build 3 of them, and we can all live up here. We don't ever have to go back and face the real world. Isn't that a typical feeling or a temptation that we have? And he was trying to avoid this kind of thing. But Jesus said, no. You can be on the mountaintop for a while and love every moment of it, but eventually life is not about escaping from a problem. Life is about encountering the problem, encouraged enough to be able to handle it. Okay. So they get there, and this man comes running to Jesus and he says, oh, I'm so glad that you're here because I brought my child to your disciples to help. And guess what? They couldn't help me. What a disappointment. He really reached out to those people who were followers of Jesus. He had a great need, a desperate need, a kid who was sick, a kid who was messed up. Doesn't tell us how old this child was, but he had problems. And he brought him to the disciples, and it says, the man says, they couldn't do anything. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. That had to be disappointing. And I know that there's a lot of times that all of us have been disappointed when we reached out to someone and asked for help, and they didn't deliver. Sometimes the people of God. Sometimes some of us here have asked other ones of us here for help. Can you pray for my sick boy? And can you help in this specific way? And they tried, and it just didn't happen. It just didn't work. Somehow we're not successful. And it could be that you're tempted in a situation like that to just say, well, so much for that. So much for seeking help from God. So much for turning to God's people for help. I want to say to you that you should do like this man, and that I should do like this man. If we're having trouble finding help at a human level, we should not be discouraged, but just keep looking to and seeking help from the Lord in the best way we can. I assume these disciples were doing the best that they could. In fact, they themselves were quite baffled later. They sat down with Jesus and they said, why couldn't we drive this demon out? And many times when we seek other help from other people and they're not able to deliver in a way that makes us feel happy or satisfied, we might be tempted to feel bitter or feel disappointed or to feel like they've let us down. But maybe that person did the best that they could. Now, maybe not. It could be they were very cavalier about it, and kind of apathetic, and they really didn't take your need seriously. And if so, maybe you need to try to point that out to them. But it could also be at times that you've asked somebody for help, and they really tried the best that they could, and they still couldn't. They just couldn't satisfy you or make the connection, make it happen the way you wanted and the way they even wanted. I'm sure these disciples felt very bad that they couldn't cast this demon out of this boy. And I'm saying in a case like that, do what this guy did. He said, well, I thank you for trying, but I see Jesus has arrived. I'm going to take the kid to him. We need to just continue to ask and not give up. Because some problems only God can solve. When Jesus said in his famous Sermon on the Mount, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open. He wasn't talking about asking your neighbor. He wasn't talking about asking the government. He wasn't talking about asking a psychic. Ask. He wasn't talking about asking a preacher. The whole sermon and the whole context of what he's saying is ask God. Seek God. Knock on heaven's door. You can try using men. You can seek help with men, and say, would you also knock on heaven's door? But when he said ask and seek and knock, he's not talking about the fact that we should just seek help from each other. And so he brought this boy. He said they tried to help, and they weren't able to. If you could do anything, and this is where Jesus backs off and says, whoa. Did you just say what I thought you said? Did you really say, if you can do anything? And Jesus really rebuffed him. And he said, yes, I can do anything. In fact, there's nothing I cannot do if you believe. So it's a challenge to this man's belief. It's a challenge to ours. And then the story unfolds of the actual healing or exorcism of this demonic spirit. And I want to just spend a moment here to think about the dynamics. First of all, this kid, the Bible or the father describes this child, and it's pretty bad. Some people have said, well, it just sounds like he had epilepsy. It's a quite severe case of epilepsy. Maybe he did. But the Bible's clear, and the Father's quite certain, and Jesus' response is also very clear, that this was more than just physiology. Maybe the kid did have epilepsy, but he also was troubled or oppressed by the spirit of an evil spirit, a demonic spirit. And that's a whole can of worms to try to figure out. But this somehow had the ability to leap into control of this kid, or to even control his body. And he tells how the father says it foams at the mouth, and he'll fall into fire, fall into water. Obviously an attempt of another inhabiting, indwelling force to try to destroy the physical body of. And demons do and can inhabit physical bodies. And the Bible talks about that in some other places. That's not this sermon. But while he brings this boy, it says that the spirit seized him, and he flapped to the ground, and he's stiff as a board, and he's convulsing around. I don't know about you, but I would have at that point kind of panicked. If somebody just hit the deck and they're obviously moaning and rolling and groaning in terrific, horrible situation, I would have said, I'd probably got pretty excited. Call 911! I'm sorry, Zane. I'm very sorry. I did not mean to startle you. I would have yelled, call 911. But Jesus was 911. With nobody to call. He is the master of the universe. And it just kind of amazes me when I read that while this kid is in a terrible situation, and I'm sure that others panicked in horror at what they see as this demon actually seizes control. And if you've ever been around anything like this, if you've ever seen anything like this, it is mind-blowing. I'll tell you, it'll make the hairs just stand right up on your neck if you have any. And it's a situation as human beings that we could very quickly become quite emotional, quite desperate. And I look at Jesus, and this is what I see. He didn't get all emotional. He didn't yell or scream or get excited or jump or run or anything. He said, how long has he been like this? I mean, just the factual, down to earth, thinking it through. What can be done here? How can I handle this? Attitude. There was no desperation. You know, it must have been a horrible sight that he's called. And there are times that any of us, all of us in our lives are what's the word I want? We end up having to deal with some horrible things, seeing some horrible sights. I was talking to Jeff and Beth Bittner this week, and they were telling me about a recent experience of theirs. They were at the beach and met with a friend, and while they were there, their friend's son died. And Jeff and Beth were the first ones there to find this kid laying on the floor, dead. 19 years old, I think he said. It was a horrible thing to see. Just as this child laying out here on the ground, writhing around, it's a horrible thing to see. And all I'm saying is, you know, in those kind of moments, we get desperate because we're just rattled. And Jesus wasn't. He said, how long has he been like this? He's just trying to kind of assess the facts and understand the situation as best that he can. And the father told him, you know, he's had this thing for a long time, and this thing has bugged him since he was young, and I don't understand how, and I don't understand the dynamics of how it is that Satan is able to manifest himself like this in a child. But here's an example of when it happens. And Jesus, when he saw the scope of the situation, he not only didn't panic, but there was no hesitation in him, none whatsoever. I would have hesitated. I would have said, I don't know hardly where to start. What prayer is there? What song is there? What class could I go to learn how to do this? Jesus said, bring him to me. Bring him here. Bring him over here, man. He was confident, absolutely confident. There was no hesitation whatsoever because he knew who he was and he knew what was going to happen, and he knew that Satan had no choice because Satan's a created being under God's control. And I don't care how he might bluff people. I don't care how he might have destroyed people in the past. You and I can know that there is no hesitation on the part of Christ in dealing with the works of Satan, the effects of Satan, the addictions of Satan, any of the things that Satan uses to manifest in our life. There was not only no hesitation on the part of Jesus, but when he brought the boy over, there was no intimidation on his part either. It says he rebuked him and he said, "You deaf, mute spirit, come out and never come back." I mean, that was just what he said. I mean, he didn't mess around. He didn't say, "Please leave this boy alone." And this intrigues me and interests me and makes me rejoice also that he said, "Don't come back." I love that. He didn't just say, "Get out of here." He said, "Don't come back." Wouldn't you like to say that to Satan? Well, I think we can. Because if we can believe, all things are possible. When we can believe. And Jesus said, "Look, I'm not going to tolerate this. I'm not interested in giving you just temporary relief from some problem or some trial. My standard is much higher than that. My standard is freedom from Satan's oppression. My standard is freedom from any other kind of oppression or debilitation that you may face. So come out of him and never come back." And it says in the gospel here that the Spirit, in one last, I guess, gory, evil attempt to just tear up the battlefield while you retreat, it says that he threw the boy to the ground and convulsed him violently. And the spirit shrieked. It wasn't the boy, it was the spirit using the human voice, the vocal cords of this boy, making a noise. I have heard that. It is a sound and an instance where you know this is not the person. It is strange. And if you don't have the power of God within you, it would be very frightening, I think. But Jesus wasn't frightened, and we don't have any reason to be frightened either. And it says that when this happened, when the spirit left and came out of and exited this kid's body, that it looked like he was dead. He just lay there, still, pale, looking like a corpse. And the people said, "Oh, he's dead." I know, and you know, wait a minute, I got that backwards. I know. I don't know why. What do? I know, and you know, that was a misdiagnosis. This boy was far from dead. This boy had a marvelous future ahead of him. This boy actually was just getting started because he was just now being able to be healed and put in his right mind and given freedom from, if you have grown up with or have experienced yourself a debilitating physical situation. Let's say like epilepsy. You know that you always maybe feel like you're at the mercy of something. There's something there that's sort of always in the back of your mind that it could take over at any time. It could embarrass you. It could hurt you. It could cause you lots of problems. This boy's life without all that was just beginning. So he wasn't dead at all. He's just getting ready to live, just getting ready to start. But when I see the reaction of this crowd and how absolutely wrong they were in what they thought about this boy, it just makes me stop and think of how we misdiagnose each other. And how it is that at times people say absolutely negative and horrible things about each other and treat each other as if they were dead, as if they didn't matter at all. That people may look at you, or I'll just make it personal. Some of you here in this room have had people treat you. You have been mistreated. You have been insulted in terrible ways. Some of you here in this room have had some extremely demeaning and low-down things said about you. You have heard it said that you were worthless, that you were stupid, that you were unloved, that you were unwanted. Recently, a lady told me her own mother said to her, "Oh, I wish you had never been born." Unimaginable. The kind of trash, the kind of garbage that we throw at each other. And I know that some of you have been through this because I have heard your stories and I have seen your tears and I have felt your pain. And sometimes there's these misdiagnoses where we have angry words flung at us, or we have terrible things perpetrated upon us as if we don't matter, as if we're dead, or as if they hoped we were. Sometimes it's from our parents. Sometimes it's from our own children. Sometimes it's from siblings. Sometimes it's from peers. I have heard stories of people who were treated this way by their teachers. When they were a kid at school and their teachers told them basically they didn't count, they didn't matter, they would never amount to anything, they were worthless and so forth. Some of us have been abused and mistreated and lied to and cheated on by our mate. The very person in the whole world who promised to cherish you and love you and take care of you, and they despised you, and they did just the opposite. In other words, they acted as if you didn't matter at all. Your feelings or your future didn't really make any difference to them. They would just run right over top of you, in essence saying, they don't matter, they're dead. It makes me think of this. These people standing around and they're looking at this kid who really has a very bright future. and they don't see it. They don't feel that way in that moment. I hope that you can just listen to me for a moment. Because if you've been mistreated in that kind of a way, or you've had some horrible things said about you, almost as if you weren't even here and you didn't even count, I want you to understand that the Lord Jesus Christ says the same thing about you this morning that He said about that boy. When He didn't say it with words, but He said it through His gestures. When He said, absolutely not true. Watch this. And He reached down and He picked this boy up by the hand. This child, Jesus is saying, this child has shrieked and moaned long enough. And this child is worth more than all the world. And he is far from dead. He has a future. He is loved. There is a purpose for him. And all of the mistreatment of the past is not going to control him. And the devil is not going to kill him. And some of us need to hear that sometimes. Because we have been treated in that way. Aren't you glad that God says that you have value, that you have a future? That's what He was saying to this boy. Now, there was a happy ending to the story, but the disciples had a few frustrated moments when they later privately met with Jesus. And they said, why couldn't we make this work? And I think all of us have felt this way at times. I certainly have, many times. You know, there have been times where I've prayed with someone and they came back later and reported that amazing things had happened, that God had heard our prayer. I've prayed with other folks and they died. Or just went the opposite way than what I had asked for or what I had desired in prayer. And I don't know the answer. You know, these men had been given authority over demons. I put some scripture verses there. Not just that. It says in, I think in Matthew 10, that they had been successful. They came back and they said, Lord, even the demons are under our control. This is pretty amazing. When we speak, they jump. And Jesus said, don't get too excited about that. Just rejoice that your name is written in the book of life. But they had seen success. Now, it wasn't happening. Or didn't in this case. And they said, I don't understand. And I can only say two things in response, because this is the only two things that Jesus mentioned. I don't ultimately know why in this case, or why in certain cases with us, it seems like it seemed like our prayers weren't answered, and at other times it seems like surely God did hear, and He did see, and He did cast out the demon. But what He said here in Mark chapter 9, it says, verse 29, that He replied, this kind can come out only by prayer. Now, if you would hold that scripture a second, if you're in your Bible, if you would look at Matthew 17, where the same exact story is told by Matthew. Matthew has an additional comment that Jesus made. In Matthew 17, this is verse 20. In verse 19, it said, the disciples came in private and said to Jesus, why couldn't we drive it out? And He replied, now He didn't, now in Mark's version, he says, well, this only comes by prayer. But here Matthew has an additional thing that Jesus said that Mark simply didn't record. He said, Jesus said, because you have so little faith. I tell you the truth, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. So, between these two Gospels, between Matthew and Mark, Jesus mentions, if you put them together, He mentions two things. He mentions prayer, and He mentions faith. And what He says about faith in Matthew is certainly not a compliment. What He says there is, let me see, what He says in Matthew is, your faith is so small. That's why you cannot drive it out. That's why you didn't drive it out. Your faith was too small. That's what He says. He didn't say you didn't have any faith. He didn't say you didn't trust God. He didn't say you weren't saved. He didn't say that you didn't love me. He said your faith is small. And amazingly, to me, I mean, this blows my mind, he picked like the smallest thing in the world, a little tiny seed, the seed of a mustard plant. And you've all seen these, illustrated mustard seed, just a little tiny thing, like a reddish seed, just a little tiny black heart, minuscule thing. And he said, if your faith could just get that big, it could do anything. If you could just have faith as big as a mustard seed, when I read that, I think, but that's about as small as you can get. And he's saying, yeah, you don't even have that. I believe that's what he's saying. That our faith doesn't even compare with the smallness of a little garden seed, of mustard seed. What about prayer? What is the purpose, or what is the meaning, or what is the relationship or the role of prayer? Why does he also say this kind, sometimes it can only happen by prayer? And what is the correlation between prayer and faith? I want to leave you with this thought. These men were empowered. We are empowered. Jesus sent them out and said, look, heal the sick, raise the dead, and cast out demons. And they had done some of it. And he gives to us, I believe, that same commission and that same empowerment. Somehow or other, in their weakness and their humanity in that particular situation, whatever combination of factors, they didn't appropriate it. They weren't seizing hold of that faith. And that's where I believe the point of prayer is made. That the role of prayer at times like this is to raise our level of faith. It's to increase our vision. In other words, the more I talk with God, the closer my fellowship with God becomes, the deeper my time and my focus through prayer, the more I see as God sees. And then the greater the faith that I have. The more I spend time in God's presence. And I don't mean more necessarily by minutes. I'm not trying to measure, well, you only pray for 10 minutes, you should pray for 15. I don't think that's exactly the point. It is the realness of the prayer that matters. Does prayer really take me into the throne room and the presence of God? So that after I have prayed for a while, I'm ready for anything this world has to me because I'm seeing it from God's point of view. In prayer, my vision and my faith increases. That's what he's saying. And so he's saying, look, sometimes you just didn't pray long enough. You just didn't pray serious enough. You never got your level of faith to where it needed to be. And instantly, I know as human beings, I know the tendency to equate faith with emotion. We get kind of all rattled up and we say, I got to have faith. And we have difficulty sometimes separating our faith from an emotional high. But it's not the same. I'm not saying that the two cannot be interrelated. And you've all seen people get pretty excited in a service of healing or in a time where they feel like their faith is in operation. There's nothing wrong with it, but I'm just saying let's keep it clear and realize that Jesus isn't talking about emotion. He didn't say you can't get your emotion whipped up enough. He said you can't get your faith as big as a mustard seed. And if you could, and you did, and over and over, Jesus criticized people for not having enough faith. They had faith, but for example, remember in the storm on the ocean, and water was coming in, and the disciples were crying out in fear, and Jesus turned, and what did he do? Remember what Jesus did in the storm on the Sea of Galilee? Help me out. He calmed the sea. That's right. But before he calmed the sea, you know what he did? You can read it. He said, before he ever even turned to the waves and said, simmer down, he said, why are you afraid, oh, you little faith? That was his first concern. Before he bothered to stop the storm, was to kind of scold these disciples for not believing and having faith and having faith in God. So it comes back here. I'll go back to this as I have to close here. To the second conundrum that the Father came to with Jesus when Jesus was sort of offended and said, "What do you mean, if I can, if I can? If you can believe." In other words, Jesus seized on the fact that his Father said, "If you can, would you please help me?" And Jesus is kind of turned the tables back on him. And he said, it seems to me the problem, in other words, this man's question is tempered with doubt. He comes to Jesus and he says, "If you can, would you please help?" And Jesus is saying to him, I believe, back in return, seems to me the problem isn't whether I can, it's whether you can believe that I can. Isn't this what we're like? That we all somehow have within us this combination of faith and doubt. And the Father realized that he did doubt. And he said, "Well, Lord, I do believe, but I don't know if I believe all the way through. I don't know if I believe 100%. Help my unbelief." And Jesus honored that because it was a prayer that was saying, "I have faith, but give me more." And of course, also he had compassion on this son, and he also had a statement to make about the kingdom of God here in the territory of the devil, which is a wonderful thing. It's a challenge to us. But when we cry out to God, let's not just simply cry in desperation, but let's cry out in faith.